Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 11th of April, where we've put some closure on Richard II. Thank you for submitting in your journals, and I will be getting those back to you this week. And we are moving forward with Macbeth. And this is our tragedy section. So basically, usually when we talk about Shakespeare, we talk about his great tragedies. These are the height of his career. And this is related to what we discussed last class about tragic hero, the idea that there's a great man who is above and beyond the ordinary, who experiences downfall in part because of outside forces, but in part because of his own flaws in character. And then that character accepts some level of responsibility, and we as audience experience a sense of learning. But that said, Shakespeare would play with that definition as he created some of his great tragic characters. And notice just how the names of the plays have changed from something like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, where no central character is named in the title, to things like Macbeth and Othello. And those are the two that we will be focused on. Othello will be very similar to Much Ado About Nothing, but in a negative way, obviously, because tragedies end in death, unlike comedies. And Macbeth is Shakespeare's shortest play. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to do Macbeth, to make sure that we had enough time in the semester to be able to do two tragedies. And it's known as a cursed play, that it is a play that should not be stated, or at least its title should not be stated on stage, and that it's known as the Scottish play or the M play. Lots of folklore and superstition associated with this particular play. It has a very dark atmosphere, as we would expect with a tragedy. It's a very nervous, jittery kind of play. I think that it's important that it be so short because it really isn't about murder, it's about the consequences of murder. So that happens very quickly. In fact, there's even been some debate as to whether or not, because of its short length, could there perhaps be a section missing of the play. I don't think that's the case. I think that Shakespeare deliberately meant the play to be short, not only to show how quickly the descent into evil can occur and the consequences resulting from that, but also at this particular point in time, Queen Elizabeth would no longer be in reign and King James would be in reign. Now, remember, we were talking about the idea of it being very politically sensitive to talk about issues that were going on during the time. And during the time, the major question was who would succeed Queen Elizabeth, because there wasn't a direct heir in place, because she was the Virgin Queen. In other words, she had never married. So there was lots of vying and jockeying. But rather than talk about that and risk difficulty, what Shakespeare did was create plays such as Richard II, where we have a central question as to who has the right to rule. Should it be the person with the closest blood right? And again, that would be under dispute with Queen Elizabeth because she didn't have a direct heir. Or would it be somebody who was perhaps further removed in the bloodline, but perhaps had a greater ability to rule? And we saw that tension with Bolingbroke and Richard. And of course, this is one of the ways that Renaissance society could have grappled with their own question about who would succeed Queen Elizabeth without actually talking about who would succeed Queen Elizabeth. So, who did succeed Queen Elizabeth? King Richard. And he was the King of Scotland. And notice that this play is about a Scottish king. And also, Richard, while he didn't mind theater, he wasn't necessarily a supporter of the theater in the way that Queen Elizabeth was. And he was known to like short plays. So, if you put all of this together, I think it's very obvious that Shakespeare wrote a short play that was about a Scottish king. And also, it turns out that King James was very interested in the supernatural. So, what we have is Macbeth, which is basically a play about elements of the supernatural with the three witches. So I think in very typical Shakespearean fashion, what Shakespeare was doing was writing a play for King James. In effect, much like he would oftentimes write plays with flattery embedded within them for Queen Elizabeth. So I think this was a very clever technique from Shakespeare's perspective. And we've got some very strong female characters in this play. Not only the witches, but Lady Macbeth. Unfortunately, they're all evil. We'll talk about what that might mean. But as always, I wanted to talk about performance first, and then we can get into the text itself. So at this point, you should have put conclusion onto Richard II. You should have finished reading that, and you should be in the midst of reading Macbeth. And in terms of performance, prior to the Globe Theater reconstruction that I had talked about with the Midsummer Night's Dream, probably the premier Shakespearean performers would be the Royal Shakespeare Company. And they still have a great amount of prestige performing in London. And I wanted to show you a version of their Macbeth that's quite famous, that stars Sir Ian McClellan, a very young Ian McClellan, as Macbeth. And one of the interesting things is that after we see this performance, which I think is quite haunting, the witch characterization itself I find to be rather disturbing. And as you know, I'm interested in elements of the supernatural. Not only do I teach a Gothic literature class, but I also teach a class in horror film. And yet this version of Macbeth, it always serves to make me feel uncomfortable. And again, that's sort of an odd thing that someone would want to feel uncomfortable. But if you're a fan of the Gothic or of horror, then you probably are looking for that vicarious experience where you can have that emotion in a safe way. It's one of the things that I talk about in both of my Gothic lit class and also my horror film class in further depth. But at any rate, I think you'll find it to be a haunting production. And I thought we could watch the first half of it this class, and then we could put closure onto it next class. And then in our third class, we could actually see Ian McClellan as Macbeth talking a little bit about his craft and what went into his particular performance before we actually start talking about the play itself. So if you look at the notes below, you'll see that I've got a YouTube link where you can watch the Royal Shakespeare Company's version of Macbeth. And today's attendance question, which will be due Wednesday on April 13th at 8 a.m. And again, if you need additional time, please let me know. Do you think the witches are an outside force influencing Macbeth's subsequent actions? And why or why not? Remember, again, we talked about the idea of a tragic hero, and could there be some sort of an outside force that's controlling and manipulating? In the truest tradition of tragedy, and that would be the Greek play Oedipus the King, the outside force is a prophecy, or sometimes known as fate. And whether or not we can view the witches as an outside force is something that I would be very curious to hear your perspective on. Again, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but I do ask that you read all of your classmates' responses and my responses to those so that you get a sense of what we might have talked about in class. So without any further ado, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and enjoy the first part of Macbeth. So I'm asking you to watch up until minute 58:15. Take care. Bye-bye.